What's poppin'? As your usual 20-something Zoomer, I am on the internet a lot, whether it's on YouTube, Reddit, Twitter, and etc., to look at memes, doing research, and arguing with strangers on the internet. You know, regular internet things. When I argue, it tends to be with conservatives and right-wingers, the occasional alt-righter, Nazi, and centrists, usually on topics regarding science, media, human rights, and the main topic of this video, systemic racism. I noticed how many on the right would say it's not real.
Right, when it comes to conspiracy theory, everything can be explained by malevolent people behind the scenes pulling the strings, right? This is the sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Or, by the way, the idea of institutional racism, that a bunch of white people are sitting behind the scenes and deliberately attempting to harm black people. Right? If you're making that argument, you're an idiot. There is not some cadre of white people out there who are like, how do we keep black people down today? That does not exist. That is not a thing. If there are people who think that way, they're living in a bunker somewhere in Idaho, right? I mean, that is, and it's like 4 of them. So that's not real.
But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently or Asian people differently or white people differently, simply doesn't exist.
This is a manufactured crisis, manufactured for political and other reasons. People need meaning in life, so this gives them meaning. I'm fighting racism. That's beautiful. But there's not much racism to fight.
They're simply wrong saying that systemic racism is not real. Now, before I dive into how they are wrong, we must first discuss, what is racism? Well, before June 2020, Merriam-Webster's dictionary had racism as follows: a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. It gives an idea, but at the same time, it is way too vague to describe the phenomenon as racism. Vanderbilt University, however, got it covered. Racism, the systemic subordination of members of targeted racial groups who have relatively little social power in the United States, blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asians, by the members of the agent racial group who have relatively more social power, whites. This subordination is supported by the actions of individuals, cultural norms, and values, and the institutional structures and practices of society. Racism is more than just a belief that one group is better than the other or that one is inferior. It is the action that perpetuates discrimination amongst those with little social power within a given country, or in this case, the United States. Racism can be explicit, implicit, and/or systemic. The easiest type of racism to explain is explicit racism. Explicit racism, also known as overt racism, is racism that stems from explicit biases we are aware of on a conscious level. Like implicit, it is not limited by race, gender, or even country of origin. Explicit racism is overt and often intentional, for it is practiced by individuals and institutions that openly embrace racial discrimination and hold prejudicial attitudes toward racially defined groups. Examples of explicit racism would be slavery, the Jim Crow laws, harm towards racial groups, and etc. Many people, usually right-wingers, consider this the only valid form of racism. Implicit racism is racism that stems from implicit bias, when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. Like explicit bias, it is not limited by race, gender, or even country of origin. It is racist attitudes, beliefs, or thoughts which we enact unconsciously. A fairly commonplace example of this is seen in studies that show white people will frequently associate criminality with black people without even realizing they're doing it. Stereotypes in media that negatively portray non-white people, and much more. Implicit biases often predict how we'll behave more accurately than our conscious values. As previously mentioned, Merriam-Webster only had racism as a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, that our racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. This definition is too vague to describe the system and actions of what racism is. Thanks to Kennedy Mitchum, a recent graduate of Drake University, suggested that the definition should include a reference to systemic oppression, which they eventually added. The second definition is as follows: the systemic oppression of a racial group to be social, economic, and politically advantage of another. What is this systemic oppression? Well, that is what systemic racism is. It's racism by outcome. This form of racism is often the most contested with right-wingers. Fuck what these people are saying. Double fuck these Cooney crisp head asses. Systemic racism, also known as institutional racism, is a network of institutional structures, policies, and practices that create advantages and benefits for whites, and discrimination, oppression, and disadvantage for people from targeted racial groups. The advantages created for whites are often invisible to them, or are considered rights available to everyone as opposed to privileges awarded to only some individuals and groups. It can lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, among other issues. Now, I'm not saying black people or other minorities can't succeed in this country. I'm saying that a large portion of them are systematically disadvantaged and have a harder time doing so. We can succeed in spite of the racism there, but we should still do something about it. I'm going to start with the criminal justice system due to it being one of the largest institutions in which black people and other people of color are disproportionately affected, and here's the proof. A study by the Justice Policy shows that while white and black Americans admit to using and selling illicit drugs at similar rates, black Americans are vastly more likely to go to prison for a drug offense. In 2002, black Americans were incarcerated for drug offenses at 10 times the rate of white Americans. Today, blacks are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for a marijuana offense as whites, despite similar usage. 97% of large population counties have racial biases in their drug offense incarceration. I understand that illicit drugs are, illegal, but even when used at comparable rates, it is unfair that black people will be targeted more for doing the same crime. It's also messed up how they will get longer sentences and have those sentences carry mandatory minimums. Examination of federal data indicates black Americans spend about 10% more time in prison when compared to comparable whites who commit the same crimes. Additionally, black arrestees are 75% more likely to be charged with a crime carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. Prosecutors contribute massively to this undeniable racial bias. Now, some might make the same arguments that blacks commit more violent crime, and that is true. Even when those factors are taken into account, they still get longer stays, and a lot of that has to do with racial bias and an unequal access to plea deals. As shown by the Bureau of Justice Assistance Research Summary on Plea and Charge Bargaining, the majority of research on race and sentencing outcomes shows that blacks are less likely than whites to receive reduced pleas. Studies that assess the effects of race find that blacks are less likely to receive a reduced charge compared with whites. Studies have generally found a relationship between race and whether or not defendant receives a reduced charge. Worse than no plea deals lead to longer sentences with more charges. Despite this, the lighter you are, the less time one will receive in jail. Jennifer L. Hochschild, professor of African and African American Studies and Harvard professor, published The Skin Color Paradox in the American Racial Order, shows this phenomenon. The study looked at 67,000 first-time felons in Georgia from 1995 to 2002. The average sentence for white men was 2,689 days. The average for black men was 378 days longer, but light-skinned blacks received sentences of about 3.5 months longer than whites. Medium-skinned blacks received a sentence about a year longer. Dark-skinned blacks received sentences of 1.5 years longer. The system was created not to work in the favor of black people. I guess that is what they mean when they say black privilege. Worse plea deals, getting longer jail sentences, and if I'm dark, which I am, my sentences are longer than my light-skinned counterparts. I wonder what else this black privilege will get me. Oh yeah, shot by the police. As posted by The Guardian, people of color are killed at a disproportionate rate, even more so when unarmed. Despite being 13% of the population, black people were involved with 28% of deaths by police. Why are minorities killed disproportionately? The American Journal of Public Health got us covered. In their study of police-related deaths and neighborhood economic and racial ethnic polarization, they show that police disproportionately target low-income and people of color neighborhoods. Overall, police-related death rates were highest in neighborhoods with the greatest concentrations of low-income residents and residents of color. Despite all the evidence provided showing the existence of systemic racism in the criminal justice system alone, why do so many people not see it as true? But politics aside, it's because many people, mostly white people, are disaffected and just don't care. They see discrimination where it's not. It's why so many of them scream Blue Lives Matter in spite of the bias many officers have against people of color. As shown by Ryan LeCount in his research paper, More Black Than Blue, Comparing the Racial Attitudes of Police to Citizens, highlights the philosophical, social power, and group power and racial reasons why white police officers have discriminatory bias against African Americans. Data collected via nationally representative survey, which focuses on a number of specific racial attitudes of police officers to gain a broader understanding of their racial views and biases. This study finds that officers believe blacks are more violent, lazy, and should not be given special treatment compared to whites. Further highlights that those with less education adopt conservative views on race and their harmful impacts discrimination denial can have, i.e. shows how denial of racial discrimination can lead to the establishment of racial hierarchy. Hopefully this explains more about when we say like the police don't really think that highly of us. They low-key don't. But you know, it is what it is. If they still choose to ignore the racial profilings and killings of people of color, that's okay. A lot of us are used to them excusing racism.
I can excuse racism, but I draw the line at animal cruelty.
You can excuse racism.
Stated by the Department of Justice, police shooting family dogs has become an epidemic. The Department of Justice estimates that around 25 to 30 dogs are killed by cops every day, with some numbers as high as 10,000 per year. The totals could be higher. Most police agencies do not formally track officer-involved shootings involving an animal. I get it. Nobody wants to be called a racist, but even more people hate experiencing racism. Systemic racism is not me saying minorities or people of color can't do anything with their lives. It's not playing into some leftist indoctrinated Marxist victimhood mentality or some bullshit conservatives and racists believe to discount the reality of the oppression people still face in this country today. Legally, we are equal, but there's a huge but. The reality of the situation is that it's not true. It's proven here, just being black or dark-skinned in this country affects how you are seen and punished. The data just proves the system was made to hold us down, and I haven't even scratched the surface on systemic racism and criminal justice. There's a lot of bad faith actors who deny its existence, and the fact of the matter is, they are simply wrong.